So let's start with a question. What do you think about when you hear the word war? Most people will think about violent fighting, bullet piercing through flesh, explosions, guns. Most people will think about world history, World War I, World War II, and even the Philippine-American War, brilliantly portrayed through the movie I hope you all have seen, General Luna. Most people will think about fictitious wars, Harry Potter versus Voldemort, White Walkers versus humans in Game of Thrones, and even the battle between Sentinel and Scourge in Defense of the Ancients, or Dota. What's common in all these thoughts of war? I think when we think about war, we think about two sides. One side represents good, one side represents evil. But I'm here today to convince you and show you that that is usually wrong. Let me tell you two stories about war. The first story is about my curfew. So, I had a war going on with my parents when I was in university because they demanded that I should be home by 6 o'clock every night. And that was not fun at all because every night after 6 p.m. is when the fun starts. My friends would usually go out, have dinner, watch a movie, study together. And my parents didn't understand me. In their heads, if they allowed me to go out past 6 p.m., I would go crazy. They think I would go partying. They think I would go drinking. They think I would commit a crime of going on dates. They imagine these exaggerated scenarios, but if they only understood me, they would find out that all I wanted to do was go out with my friends, study with them, and drink overpriced coffee. Let me tell you a second story. This one is a little bit more serious. One usual morning in 2001, when my parents and I were watching the news, we saw this. It was 9/11, September 11, and we saw the Twin Towers in the United States come crumbling down. In the same year, hundreds of Filipinos were actually killed in attacks organized by a terrorist organization called the Abu Sayyaf. These events made, sadly, a deep impression in a nation that is 80% Christian and 5% Muslim. By 2005, a survey commissioned by the United Nations created a report called the Philippine Human Development Report that stated that more than 50% of Filipinos think that Muslims are more prone to violence. In the same survey, 90% of Filipinos, when asked to choose between hiring someone with a Christian-sounding name or hiring someone with a Muslim-sounding name, 90% would choose the one with a Christian-sounding name. Sadly, the conflict in Muslim Mindanao persists today, with beheadings and kidnappings becoming worldwide news. Let's stop for a while. Let's think, why is this happening? Why is this conflict happening? There's a really complex answer to that. First, you have to think about history. For hundreds of years, under the Spanish and American regimes, a lot of Muslim Filipinos were oppressed by this government. You need to look at economics, land, and therefore economic resources that were by right owned by Muslim and indigenous groups were forcibly transferred to new inhabitants of Mindanao. You need to look at GDP. Residents of the Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, or ARMM, unfortunately have the lowest income per capita in the country. This conflict persists, I tell you, not because of religion, but because of inequality. Inequality in income, resources, and even respect. I look at the faces of the members of the Abu Sayyaf, and all I can think about is that they are victims. They are victims of oppression, discrimination, and inequality, and if you were a victim of those forces, you would be upset too. What is the government doing about this? So far, most actions have been military in nature. They've been sending guns to Mindanao. But If they only understood what is really happening in Muslim Mindanao, instead of sending guns, they'd send books, they'd send computers, they'd send jobs, land titles, and respect. In both stories, I hope you noticed that I used the key phrase. The 4 words, if they only understood. If my parents only understood, they would let me out after 6. If the government only understood, they wouldn't be going on an all-out war. I refuse to believe that wars are essentially good versus evil because it's usually, you can see it, a lot more complex than that. And how do you deal with this complexity as you search for solutions? Well, you understand as much as you can. Let's zoom out a little. I would be remiss if I didn't say that the world is undergoing war right now. The world has recently been the victim of attacks in Nice, Brussels, Paris, and Istanbul due to the movement of groups like the Islamic State or ISIS. War continues to rage in Syria and Palestine. But you know, this global war is not just one that's physical and violent. It's also a war based on beliefs and perceptions and ideologies. We recently had this issue called Brexit, where people who believed in Brexit outnumbered people who don't. We recently elected a new president of the United States, and that happened because people who supported Trump's campaign outnumbered the people who don't. And in the Philippines, every time you open Facebook or Twitter, you're faced with a debate between people who support the actions of President Duterte and those who don't. It's a never-ending debate, and I hope that this is stressing you out on social media right now. In workplaces and businesses and schools, there's also an ongoing war. It's millennials like me refusing to follow status quo and old traditions and fighting for new borders in our workplaces and schools. Conflict is an essential part of human life, but when conflict creates hatred and violence, you know you have to do something about it. Let's go back to my parents. Why were my parents so strict? Well, unfortunately, they come from very conservative backgrounds. My dad comes from a conservative and religious Catholic background, and my mom comes from a conservative and religious Muslim background. Despite that, they were liberal, like all of us, when it comes to love. When they fell in love with each other, despite that key difference in religion, they decided to stay together. And the most fantastic thing happened. They realized that they shouldn't convert each other. So as a result, our home is built on not one, but 2 religions. And this is noteworthy because this space between Islam and Christianity is often one of conflict, especially in the Philippines. But my parents knew that something had to be done with this conflict. They wanted to use the peace that we found in our home and expand it outside. But the question was, how? How do we promote peace? And the best answer we could find was education. Our family decided to build peace libraries in communities affected by conflict, especially in Mindanao. These peace libraries are designed so that we can encourage young people of different religious and cultural backgrounds to come together in one place, learn together, read together, study together in hopes that they will develop friendships that will form the backbone of a new society built on peace. We started building libraries in 2008, and we have built around 6 libraries, most of which are in Zamboanga. We call these libraries KRIS Library, in short for Cristiano Islam. A typical day in our library looks like this. In the beginning, when we brought these Muslim and Christian students together, they would go inside and go on their separate ways. But through time, as they interacted more frequently with each other, they started forming friendships and they started to mingle more often. Aside from this mingling, we also want to produce the best quality education through books, computers, and tablets, and fun activities for the kids that we serve. In 2011, I was 16 years old at that time, I started leading the organization. When I was 16, I also entered the University of the Philippines as a full scholar. That means I didn't have to pay for anything. And just that fact that I didn't have to pay for anything made me pay it forward. So we all know that the status of education in our country is one that begs to be addressed. Out of 10 young people in the Philippines, I repeat, out of 10, only one will be able to get a degree. So we here in this room are the lucky few. This is why I launched a scholarship program in KRIS Library. We selected young people from Zamboanga and Manila who are victims of poverty and conflict, and we assisted them by paying for their tuition fees, giving them an allowance, and providing them access to our libraries. But more than the numbers, I want to tell you their stories, especially those of our college graduates. Very happy to report that last year, we were able to finish our first batch of college graduates. Thank you. Actually, I also graduated this year, but their graduation to me was actually more important. So, I want to tell you about Erica. Erica comes from a family of 5, supported by a single mother. She comes from one of the poorest slum areas in Quezon City. She never imagined she would go to college, but she always wanted to be a businesswoman. Fast forward, after we gave her our scholarship, she got a degree in business and is now selling pharmaceutical products. And she wants to be one of the biggest business tycoons in the Philippines someday. So, future investors, Erica. I want to tell you about Cha. When we first opened our KRIS Library in Zamboanga, Cha was one of the people who went to our library every day. And it wasn't just to read books or to use the computers in the library. She went every day because she wanted to teach other kids. Look at this picture. Cha taught a lot of other kids, and she told me that although she can't afford to go to college, she wanted to be a teacher. But we made that dream possible for her. And now, she teaches high school students in Zamboanga. I have so many more compelling stories of our scholars who are Muslims, Christians, and come from different backgrounds. And some of these stories I can't even tell you today because they're quite sensitive. They involve stories of being a child soldier. They involve stories where your parents or relatives are killed because of conflict. They involve stories of young people having to go into hiding because they themselves are being threatened. This violence is real. This poverty is real. And this is what continually propels me to do my job. But in all that we do through KRIS Library, we don't just give the gift of education and peace. We also give one thing that we feel is much more important, and that's hope. But honestly, let me tell you, it was a crazy experience for me to be able to give that opportunity to give hope to people. I was a teenager. I was 16, trying to run a nonprofit organization that operated nationally, that had libraries in Manila and in Zamboanga. I knew nothing about donations, about volunteers, about sponsorships. And I had to handle the problems of people, of scholars who were the same age as me. In all honesty, I was just as ignorant as them. I had to raise funds just using my Facebook account. And I was doing all this while juggling my school career as an engineering student. Aside from my family, I was only working with a bunch of other volunteers. So it was all up to me, to be honest. And because of that, I have to tell you, and I have to be honest, that I made a lot of mistakes. Last year, some of our college scholars almost weren't able to graduate because of my mistake. KRIS Library ran out of money. We searched high and low for donations, but it was really hard for us to find one given our limited network. Because of these difficulties, Although eventually they were able to graduate, I had a nervous breakdown. I just wanted to quit, I wanted to stop, and I realized maybe I was just the wrong person to head KRIS Library. Since we're talking about war already, I have to tell you that I was also at war with myself. On one hand, I was still optimistic. I was doing all these things. I was an idealist. I thought that I was a good leader and I could actually make my dreams come true. But on the other hand, it was Arizza who no longer believed in herself, who thought that she was incompetent, and who thought that she wasn't fit to lead KRIS Library. So I had these two sides in me. And while this war was going on, I realized the fundamental truth. Both sides were actually right. I believed in myself, yes, but I had these mistakes, and I had to be honest with myself. So now I'm in a learning process where I accept both sides, and I'm learning for both sides. And I think that's a bigger realization. In war, sometimes both sides are right. Sometimes it's just two different ways of looking at things. If you look at me, if you look at my resume, it's a little bit weird because I'm a graduate of industrial engineering, but I'm running a nonprofit organization that works for peace and education. If someone were to ask me, "Are you really an engineer?" I would still say yes. I'm an engineer for hope. I'm an engineer for peace. I'm an engineer for change. I believe no matter what your profession, there's always something you can contribute. I've often used, in fact, my engineering degree in KRIS Library because in industrial engineering, I've learned a little something called systems thinking. Systems thinking is a new way of solving problems. Usually, when you look at a problem, you look for one cause, and then you solve that cause to solve the problem. But in systems thinking, when you look at the problem, you don't look at one cause. You look at the system that creates that problem. You look at the different causes and the different factors, and you look at the interactions between these causes and factors, and you change the system to fix the problem. So you create solutions that are usually multidimensional, coming from different points of view. But it may sound a bit complicated, but if you boil down the concept of systems thinking to one word, this word is empathy. In KRIS Library, we use empathy as a tool to address conflict in Mindanao because we realize, coming from an empathy perspective, that terrorist organizations are able to recruit young people not because of religion, but because of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. So we wanted to give them the opportunities such that they would never have to consider becoming a terrorist. And we can use this concept of empathy for other wars as well. For instance, the war on drugs. This situation would not need to have happened if we focus on preventing the use of drugs, of illegal drugs in the first place. If we could use empathy to understand why people consume illegal drugs, is it poverty, is it inequality, is it unemployment, then we could possibly create solutions so that we could stop an addict way before he or she takes his first hit. We can win wars with no guns. But it's going to be difficult because hatred is easy, understanding is difficult. War is easy, violence is easy, but empathy is not. But I am not alone in this quest. I am with a group of 10 individuals who are working worldwide to promote peace. We're handpicked by the Kofi Annan Foundation, by the former United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan himself, to promote countering violent extremism and peace worldwide. So I work with this group of young people to show that we can be, as our organization is called, extremely together. But what is my vision for KRIS Library and for everything I'm doing right now? My vision is to promote the use of empathy, to promote it in the way we solve problems, to promote it in the way we run governments, to promote it in your lives, in your careers, as students, as businessmen, as professionals. I want you guys to use empathy in all that you do and to understand that war, these two sides, both of whom are usually victims, need to be and beg to be understood. Governments and states solve a lot of problems using violence and brute force, but we, as young people, must fight the opposite way. I want to build a new world based on empathy, because that is the only sustainable way to truly address war. Thank you.